You are listening to Mining Stock Education.
Thanks for tuning in to Mining Stock Education. I'm your host, Bill Powers, and in today's show, you're in for a treat. We haven't heard from him in a while, but Dr. Rob Stevens is back on the show with a presentation and a talk about uranium deposits, what you need to know as a uranium stock investor. Dr. Rob, thank you for coming back on the show. You're also the author of the book, Mineral Exploration and Mining Essentials, and your website is MiningEssentials.com. So thank you for coming on, and take it away.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks very much, Bill, and hello to everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to come back on your show, Bill, and this time talk a little bit about uranium. All commodities seem to be moving strongly here in February 2026, but uranium is definitely one of those. So I thought maybe it would be a time to look into those uranium deposits a little bit more to refresh ourselves about what they're all about and some of the things you should be thinking about when it comes to investment in that sector. So what I want to chat about today is a few things. We'll just start off with some uranium fundamentals. Why is it that the price is moving fairly well, and why should we be interested in it at this time? Then we'll talk about uranium deposits, so the geology side of things, so you have a bit of a sense of how those deposits form and a little bit of what they look like. And then we'll talk about uranium exploration and mining. And then finally, some considerations, some things to think about as you're looking at potential uranium company investments. So in terms of uranium fundamentals, just a number of points here to be made. I guess the key is that global demand is increasing for nuclear power generation, which is really the primary use of uranium that's mined today. And that's, an increasing need for power, but also wanting to transition away from burning coal and things like that for power. So we see that steadily increasing. Also power for AI. There's been, everybody I'm sure has been following the movement in AI, and that's requires a lot of power, those data centers for that. So there are companies looking at ways of providing power for AI through uranium. And also there's been quite a bit of interest on the investment side, just as an example, Sprott Uranium Trust, but that's also helping to fuel the demand, so to speak, of uranium. And when we come back to the power side of it, which is really, where uranium is needed, we have about 440 reactors currently operating worldwide, and there's about 170 under construction or planned. So that's not quite a doubling, but quite, or not an increase of 50%, from where we are right now, but getting close to that. So that's where that demand is coming from. There's also expected to be a structural deficit in uranium supply around 2029 or 2030. So we're not there right now, but that's starting to show up. And that's not very far into the future. I'm always a little skeptical about when I read about deficits that are 10 years out. A lot of things can happen in that time frame, but if we're only talking 3 or maybe 4 years away, I think that's a pretty good point and analysis to keep in mind. There's generally been underinvestment in exploration and with new mines. We've seen in the last few years a lot of dollars going into obviously gold, but copper, lithium, other critical minerals, uranium's been a little bit behind on that. And like pretty much all metals, it takes a long time to get new projects into production. And arguably because of the radioactive aspects of uranium, there can be more challenges there. In 2024, about 3/4 of the world's uranium production comes from Kazakhstan, Canada, Namibia, and Australia. So it's dominated by those 4 countries. And there's a lot of talk about small modular reactors that would be portable and that could power up, for example, localized AI data centers. So I think there's really great opportunities there, but as I understand it, the technology on that to make it, in more widespread use is probably 10 or 15 years out. But, that's a longer term demand fundamental that's continuing to drive the industry. So in terms of some uranium pricing, here are a couple of charts that we've just taken from the last couple of days. The chart on the left here is uranium in a 5-year chart. We can see, like a lot of metals, ups and downs that happen. And on the far right, January, February 2026, we're getting close to what has been certainly a high price point for the last 5 years. I wanted to put on the right of the screen here is a chart just of the last month. And I thought it was interesting to see that spike up over $100, but then a pretty rapid pullback. This is a bit of a short-term thing, but I think if you look at gold and silver, they also had very similar trends in this last month of a big run-up just towards the end of January, which inevitably, that's a pretty common trend, has a bit of a pullback, doesn't affect the fundamentals or the trend that we've been seeing now for the last a year or more. So in terms of uranium geology and deposits, so there are many different types of deposits. There's about 15 different models that have been generated for uranium deposits, but production is dominated by 4 main types: unconformity-related deposits, sandstone-hosted, intrusive or granite-related, and then iron oxide breccia complexes. So looking at those 4, the unconformity ones, they're dominated by deposits in the Athabasca Basin of Saskatchewan, and also some deposits in Western Australia. Sandstone are dominated by deposits in Kazakhstan and the US, intrusive or granite-related ones in Namibia, and then iron oxide breccia pretty much dominated by a single deposit, the Olympic Dam deposit in Australia, in which uranium is being produced as a byproduct, actually, of a primary copper mine. And the main minerals that we see coming out for uranium are oxide minerals. So they're not sulfides, which is what we typically see in metals, but these are oxides. Uraninite with the formula there, as well as the mineral pitchblende. So looking at global distribution and grades of uranium, the chart on the left, maybe not all that informative because it shows uranium deposits are scattered across the globe in many jurisdictions, even though, as I said, activity is being focused in just a few countries. I think the chart on the right here is interesting, which is a grade tonnage chart. And I've kind of outlined here the grades of the sandstone deposits and the unconformity deposits. A couple of things, and just for people to be able to read this chart, because it's a little different maybe than sometimes what you see for grade tonnage. So on the left is the grade of uranium in percent. On the bottom is the actual tons of uranium within the deposit itself. And then it's these diagonal lines here that are the tons of ore. And so kind of right down through the middle of the two areas I've outlined would be a deposit of 100,000 tons of ore, which isn't that much. If you think about a lot of gold or copper deposits, they're in the tens of millions of tons or even more than that in porphyry. So a lot of uranium deposits are on the smaller side, between 10 and 100,000 tons. And the grade is also quite low. 0.1% kind of goes right through the middle of the mix here, with sandstone deposits generally being lower grade and smaller, and the unconformity deposits definitely being higher grade and some of those tipping onto the larger size as well. So just summarizing the sort of grade tonnage aspects of uranium deposits, and before I talk about this chart here, I just took a screen capture of a publication called Descriptive Uranium Deposits and Mineral System Models, produced by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that's where these two images come from. If you're really into the details and want to know more specifically about individual deposit types, this publication breaks down, you can see on the cover, the 15 different deposit types, and it provides maps of where those deposits are and grade tonnage and quite a bit of description of it. So good publication if you really want to learn a little bit more. This table here is grade and tonnage just for unconformity and sandstone hosted ones, which are really the two prominent types of uranium deposits. So for tonnage, as I said, 1 to 30 million tons. So relatively small. There are a few that are more than 100 million tons, but many are quite small. And grades of 0.05 to 3% uranium, with the sandstone deposits typically being in that 0.05 to 0.4% uranium, with some unconformity deposits actually getting quite high grade, greater than 20%. Now, one thing I would say in terms of tons, a lot of the deposits are relatively small, so these are not big tonnage deposits, but what we do find is they can be sort of potty, so that within an area you could have a series of smaller deposits close to each other that could be exploited within the same operation. So there's some, even though the individual deposit is small, within a mine site you may have several different smaller deposits all being produced at the same site. Looking at just a couple of images here now of those deposits. So on the right, we have two images from the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan. So these are unconformity uranium deposits. An unconformity, just to recall that, an unconformity is an erosional surface. And the way to think about this one, and let me just jump forward one and then I'll come back. So the Athabasca Basin here is this oval body, mostly in northern Saskatchewan, and it's a sedimentary basin. So it's sediments that were deposited into a depression, eventually formed a thick sequence of sedimentary rocks. The very bottom of that basin is the unconformity. So it's an erosional surface. Below that is a very different type of rocks, and then above it are these sedimentary rocks of what's referred to as the Athabasca Basin. So that unconformity is important because that's where the ore-forming fluids travel. And like most metal deposits, uranium deposits are formed through a kind of hydrothermal process. What's a bit different here is that the hydrothermal fluids are not driven by, volcanic activity or a very strong heat source, but more fluid flow along these unconformities. And what happens is that uranium that's in the sedimentary rocks, within those sediments and also within some of the basement rocks, are dissolved in oxygen-rich waters. So that's one thing with those uranium minerals, is they will tend to dissolve into fluids that are very oxygen-rich. They travel along these unconformities, and then where they hit, as we can see in these diagrams, faults, uplifts, or breaks in the unconformity, those oxygen-rich fluids interact with more what we call reducing fluids, or reducing minerals along these faults, and that causes the uranium to deposit out. So we have this chemical reaction that happens. And so the deposits themselves are located along the unconformity, but also above it, along fault zones where the fluids may have traveled up those fault zones, or even down into the underlying basement rocks. So the target here is really to look not just at the unconformity, but then other structures that are cutting across that unconformity that are the key location of the deposit. And so when we look at the Athabasca Basin, there's a few mines that are shown on this diagram here. Right now, most of those mines that we look at are around the edge of the basin, because that's where the discoveries are easiest to be made. It's not too deep. There's some surface signature of that. Presumably there are many deposits to be found in this basin, but as you get more central into the basin, it gets deeper, harder to explore, limited surface expression. So those are challenges that are faced now as a place like the Athabasca Basin becomes a more mature exploration district. In terms of the sandstone deposits, now there's sort of a similar way in which they're forming. In this case, you have groundwater, oxygenated groundwater that's able to dissolve uranium into it that flows along sandstones. So sandstones are relatively porous rocks. You can have groundwater flowing through those. And then what happens is that groundwater, this oxygenated groundwater, flows through those sandstone sequences, they hit areas where there are organic material or sulfides or others that cause a reaction that changes that oxidation state and causes the uranium to deposit out. Often in what are called roll front deposits. You can sort of see on this diagram here in the lighter brown or the mid-colored brown, these kind of curved roll front deposits. And the idea is they form like that because in the center the fluid is flowing a little bit faster and pushes that reaction forward. So you're looking for specific sandstone beds, but ones that are confined often above and below by less permeable layers that focuses that flow of water just through the sandstone. So where there may be volcanic layers above and below or shales, we may also be looking for things like faults and uplifts that also help to focus your fluid flow. So in terms of mining, currently about 45% or so of uranium comes from conventional mines, open pit and underground. But there's a significant amount also from in situ leaching. And then about 4% is recovered as a byproduct from other minerals, primarily the Olympic Dam deposit in Australia, which I mentioned is primarily a copper deposit. And so just to emphasizing that more than 50% is produced by in situ leaching, particularly in sandstone deposits, and that's quite an economic way of extracting uranium. And I would also note that heap leaching is being considered also for a number of low-grade deposits as another quite inexpensive means of mining. Just to look at in situ leaching, so you have a sense of that. So here's a bit of a model. So we can see we've got this is a sandstone one. We have a sandstone layer in the middle, and you can see a number of smaller deposits. So it's not one big deposit, but a series of sort of roll front or bedding parallel deposits. And the idea is you go sort of outside these deposits. You have these injection wells in which oxidizing and acidic solutions are pumped down. They're pumped through the sandstone, dissolve the uranium out of the sandstone, and then are driven up back to the surface in recovery wells. And then it goes to your process plant to ultimately produce a yellow cake product, which is the end product, the uranium product at the mine. And on the right here, we can see just an example of one of those roll fronts. The sort of blacker color in there is the roll front. That's quite a small one, but that's an example of a small roll front deposit. One thing that's nice with in situ leaching is a real lack of ground impact. You don't have a pit or an underground mine in this sense. Mostly it's just wells that have been drilled. Of course, there are some concerns around groundwater in this case, but overall, the impacts of this style of mining are relatively low. So when we talk about exploration then, what we do see is most exploration, it's in Canada, the US, Australia, also China, Russia, and India, although it's a little harder to know what's going on, particularly in China and Russia, and Namibia as well. Not to say that there isn't exploration in other countries as well. So uranium exploration, the approach to it is broadly similar to the exploration for other metals. So in most ways, it's very similar approaches that are taken, but of course, some specific approaches that are particularly relevant for uranium. Many deposits are now deep. I mentioned that in the Athabasca Basin area. So that creates an additional challenge, maybe not as much surface or no surface signature. So it requires use of remote exploration techniques and deep penetrating geophysics. And it can be difficult to get good resolution in deep penetrating geophysics. More for the surface, hyperspectral and gamma ray airborne methods can detect radioactivity and alteration zones on the surface. So certainly people that are doing more grassroots exploration or greenfields in new areas, airborne methods can help detect surface anomalies. And of course, we use some standard geochemical analysis, looking for uranium and related elements in our geochemical work. So geophysics is pretty key when it comes to uranium exploration, and looking for things. The top point here, such as paleochannels, uplifts, faults, unconformities. Those channels of sandstone beds that the uranium may get focused in, uplifts that drive fluids into particular areas, faults, unconformities, all these things where the uranium-bearing fluids may travel and then react with rocks or other fluids to cause the uranium to come out. In terms of geophysics, electromagnetic surveys are used widely, detecting graphitic structural zones or major geological markers, which are a major geological marker for uranium mineralization. Not everywhere, but definitely in the unconformity ones. That's an example. And graphite are good conductors, so they can be detected with electromagnetic surveys. High-resolution magnetic and gravity surveys, understanding the geology at depth and the structural framework of those areas. Seismic surveys, which is something we don't see a lot in the metal world. Seismic's widely used in oil exploration. But because we're talking often about sedimentary basins and sequences of sedimentary rocks, seismic is quite good at resolving the structure of sedimentary basins and looking for things like unconformities, faults, and specific beds that may be good hosts for mineralization. I just note, and this is similar now to exploration for all commodities, use of drones for geophysics, for doing airborne geophysics with good resolution. And of course, AI, comes both ways. Because of AI, we need uranium for power, but AI is also making a big, change in exploration and the ability to chug huge amounts of data and do some modeling. And another part is after you've drilling, you can do downhole geophysics, so some radiometrics that can look for changes in the radioactive signature as you go down the drill hole. So finally, just to wrap this up, in terms of some considerations for investors. So as I said, we're applying similar analysis as with exploration for other commodities. That aspect that many of the deposits are deep is a challenge, but they tend to be associated with major structures, which is something that can be resolved through methods such as geophysics. Lots of interest in the uranium market, and future projected demand are looking very positive for that, not just right now, but I think in the medium term and even longer. The uranium fundamentals are very strong. Generally, uranium, they're low-grade deposits. So, 0.1 to 0.4% uranium. So if you're seeing drill intersections in that range, that's consistent. And of course, higher ones are notable. Just when you see grades reported, a lot of times you see it reported as an equivalent U308 or EU308 that is derived from radiometric measurement. So it's just meant to be a total uranium equivalent in the rocks. As I mentioned, many deposits are relatively small in total tonnage, so we're not looking for huge things here, but looking for areas where there may be many small deposits in the same area in order to exploit those within one operation. And I will note that particularly in the unconformity deposits, you do see some very high grade. So you'll see people reporting drill results that are very high grade, but often from very small deposits. So, it's that balance there. So drill hole intersection in the meters are notable. You don't need tens or hundreds of meters. You're unlikely to see that, just smaller intersections. Depth of targets also challenging both for exploration and mining. And one maybe last point, for those a bit more into geology, there are alteration zones that do occur around these deposits that can serve as vectors to exploration. So while you may not intersect a uranium deposit directly in drilling, you can notice those alteration zones that can help you to focus your efforts in, especially combined, for example, with downhole geophysics, can help you direct you towards a deposit and hopefully then success in future drilling. So there we are. That's a quick overview of uranium for your listeners there, Bill. And just thanks for mentioning my book here, Mineral Excavation and Mining Essentials, which you can find on Amazon.com and also .ca in Canada and .au in Australia. And also just mention I have some online courses that go through material like this and of course, the whole life cycle of the mining sector that you can find at miningcourses.thinkific.com. And if you just go to miningessentials.com, you can get access to both of those from there.